The emergency klaxons of the Galactic Conclave's Grand Chamber had never sounded 3 times in one session. On this day, they sounded 11. Holographic star maps flickered and spun above the central dais, splattered with the burning red of conflict zones that had not existed 48 hours ago. The Vreth hegemony, cold, methodical, and patient in their own brutal way, had done what every intelligence agency in the galaxy had called impossible. They had struck simultaneously. 17 Cellorian systems, one morning, no warning. The chamber was pandemonium. Ambassador Drawl of the Keth Dominion was on his feet, his 4 upper arms gesturing wildly at the projection maps, his voice cracking at frequencies that made the translators stutter. The Peloran representative had already fainted. Her species had a biological response to extreme stress that rendered them temporarily unconscious, and this qualified. 3 delegations were shouting over each other in a sonic wall of overlapping languages that even the Conclave's translation arrays couldn't fully untangle. And at seat 7G in the mid-tier observer block sat Ambassador Yale Orin of Earth. She was a woman of 53, with silver-streaked black hair pinned back with a simplicity that looked almost deliberately unimpressive. She wore no medals. Earth's diplomatic corps had stopped wearing medals to conclave sessions 140 years ago, after someone pointed out that other species interpreted them as aggression displays. She held a ceramic cup of something warm and dark, and she was drinking it slowly. She was watching everything, not with the wide, panicked eyes of Ambassador Drawl, not with the calculating fury of the Vreth observer across the chamber, who had already composed himself into a mask of arrogant calm. Yale watched the way a surgeon watches a patient on a table, absorbing, cataloging, utterly still. When the emergency vote was called, a formal conclave declaration condemning the Vreth aggression and mobilizing a joint response fleet, the roll call moved through the chamber like a drumbeat. Species after species slammed their confirmation panels. Yes, yes, yes. Even the Peloran delegate, freshly revived by a medic, managed a trembling affirmative. Earth, the conclave arbiter called. Yale set down her cup. She pressed the single gray button that no one ever pressed. Abstain. The chamber went quiet for the first time in an hour. It didn't stay quiet long. The noise that followed was different, not panic, but something more focused. Confusion curdling into offense. The Keth ambassador stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. A Vreth aide in the observation gallery allowed himself a small, contemptuous smile. On 17 different news networks simultaneously broadcasting the session, commentators erupted. Humanity abstains, cowardice, or calculation. Earth refuses to stand with the galaxy in its darkest hour. The humans sit on their hands while billions burn. Yale gathered her things unhurriedly, nodded politely to the delegates on either side of her, and walked out of the chamber at a pace that suggested she had somewhere more important to be and had already decided not to rush. In the corridor outside, her aide, a young man named Piotr Kavs, fell into step beside her with a data slate clutched to his chest, his face carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in his jaw. "The Keth ambassador is requesting an emergency bilateral," he said. "Tell him next week. The Cellorian Collective has already issued a public statement calling our abstention I read it. The Vreth Observer sent a personal message, he called it. I read that too." She stopped walking, turned to face a viewport that looked out over the Conclave's orbital station, and beyond it, the ink-black sprawl of space threaded with the distant light of a galaxy currently tearing itself apart. "Send the message," she said quietly. Piotr didn't ask which message. He'd been briefed. He knew there was only one message that mattered today, the one with no subject line, sent on a frequency that technically didn't exist, to an office on Earth that appeared on no public government registry. He sent it. It contained 4 words. "The board is set." Back in her apartment module on the station's diplomatic ring, Yale Orin stood at her viewport for a long time, watching the red zones multiply across the holographic star map she'd pulled up on her personal display. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look sad exactly, though something in the set of her mouth suggested she was not unmoved by the scale of the suffering beginning to unfold out there in those burning systems. She looked more than anything like someone watching a clock. Like someone who had set that clock a very long time ago and was now simply listening for it to strike. She picked up her cup again, finished her drink. The galaxy screamed around her in every frequency known to sentient life. Yale Oren said nothing. And somehow in that silence, there was something that the Vreth observer, had he seen it, would not have found comforting at all. The office had no windows. This was not an accident. Admiral Soren Vale had specifically requested a workspace with no exterior viewports when the Strategic Silence Division had been quietly carved out of Earth's Defense Directorate some 30 years ago. He'd been asked why. His answer had been written into the division's unofficial founding charter and framed on the wall opposite his desk, the only decoration in the room. Windows invite horizon thinking. We don't think in horizons, we think in centuries. Soren was 68 years old, lean in the way of people who forgot to eat when they were focused, with pale eyes that had the unnerving quality of seeming to process information slightly faster than the face around them could react. He wore a uniform with no rank insignia, because officially his rank did not exist. His division had no budget line in any public document. Its staff of 340 people were listed across a dozen other agencies as analysts, archivists, communications technicians, and in 3 cases, a janitorial contractor. He was standing in front of the largest display wall in the division's primary briefing room, which covered an entire surface of the underground facility 200 meters below the Swiss Alps. The display was not showing a battle map. It was showing something that looked, at first glance, like an extraordinarily complex web of colored threads, thousands of them, crossing and recrossing, annotated with symbols, dates, names, and resource figures in 6 galactic languages. It was, in fact, a map of every significant debt, alliance, betrayal, resource dependency, family grudge, corporate entanglement, and political secret in the known galaxy. It had taken 200 years to build. The Vreth moved early, said Director Amara Solis, the division's intelligence chief, from her seat at the briefing table. She was younger than Soren by 15 years and had the specific kind of calm that came not from peace of mind, but from processing so much catastrophic information over so long a period that catastrophe had simply lost its texture. We projected a 68% probability they'd wait another decade. They got impatient, Soren said without looking away from the web. Ukthar's been pushing the high command for 2 years. He's ambitious. Ambition compresses timelines. He traced a finger along a red thread connecting the Vreth hegemony to a cluster of smaller species on the galactic rim. It actually works in our favor. They've moved before 3 of their allied supply chains are fully secured. Ambassador Oren has sent Faye's signal. I know. He turned from the wall, sat down at the table, looked at the 7 people assembled there, the only 7 besides Yale Oren herself who knew the full scope of what had been constructed over 2 centuries. Phase 1 is done. Observation and mapping complete. Phase 2 is done. Infrastructure embedding complete. We have personnel in their logistics networks, their financial exchanges, their navigational relay stations. We have favors owed to us by 31 species who don't know they owe us, and leverage over 11 more who do know and are very uncomfortable about it. He paused. Phase 3 begins now. I want to be clear about what Phase 3 is and what it is not. He let the silence sit for a moment. It is not a war. Earth will not fire a single weapon. We will not appear on a single battle record. No human ship will cross into a conflict zone with weapons active. If anyone in this room leaks, speculates, or hints at what we are doing to any outside party, including allies, including family, this entire project becomes worthless. His pale eyes moved around the table. What Phase 3 is this. We are going to end this war. We are going to end it in a way that leaves the galaxy reshaped exactly as 2 centuries of planning intended. And when it's over, nobody will know we did it. One of the younger analysts, a woman named Dara Kess on her first year with the division, raised her hand slightly. Why? She asked. If we do all of this, if we save billions of lives and reshape galactic politics, why do we stay invisible? Why not take credit? Soren looked at her for a long moment. Because the most powerful position in any room, he said quietly, is the one nobody knows is there. He stood. Phase 3 begin. Outside, 200 meters above them, it was a clear alpine morning. Birds were singing. A light snow was falling on the mountains. The galaxy was on fire. And in a windowless room beneath the ice and rock, 30 years of preparation clicked into motion like the first gear of an enormous, silent clock. By the 43rd day of the war, the star charts had stopped being updated in real time. Not because the conclave systems had failed, though 3 relay stations had been destroyed in the fighting. but because the changes were happening faster than the cartographers could log them. Systems that had been neutral on Tuesday were occupied by Wednesday. Species that had maintained careful non-aggression pacts for centuries were suddenly finding those pacts meant nothing when a Vreth fleet materialized in their orbit and delivered a simple message: support us or burn. Most of them, to their shame and survival, chose support. The Silurian Collective, the primary target of the Vreth offensive, was not a militaristic civilization. They were traders, scientists, diplomats. Their defense fleets were respectable but not formidable, built for border patrol and piracy suppression rather than large-scale warfare. Against the Vreth war machine, which had been quietly building for 30 years under the cover of what they'd called defensive modernization, the Silurians were being systematically dismantled. Commander Ithri of the Silurian Third Fleet watched her tactical display and felt something she had not felt in 40 years of service. She felt helpless. 17 ships. She had 17 ships left in her command group against a Vreth advance force of 63. The nearest coalition reinforcements were 6 days away, if they came at all, which required trusting that the Keth Dominion would actually honor the mutual defense clause they'd been trying to quietly renegotiate for the past decade. Her communications officer flagged an incoming signal, not from the Vreth, not from the coalition. From a human cargo freighter, the ESV Constant, currently sitting in the debris field of what had been the Silurian colony of Veth Prime 3 days ago. "What does it want?" Ithri asked. "It's not asking for anything, Commander. It's offering medical supplies, full hold. And they've transmitted navigational data, alternative hyperspace corridors through the Marin Shelf that don't appear on standard charts." Ithri stared. The Marin Shelf was notoriously difficult to navigate, a region of compressed gravity eddies that had claimed dozens of ships attempting shortcuts. If humanity had charted safe corridors through it, those routes would cut 6 days of coalition travel time to 2. "Any conditions?" she asked. Her officer checked, double-checked. "No, Commander, no conditions." The ESV Constant delivered its supplies, transmitted its navigational data, and was gone within 4 hours. No press release, no demand for diplomatic recognition, no request to be included in after-action reports. It simply came, gave, and left, like a hand extended in the dark from someone who didn't need to be thanked. Ithri used the navigational data immediately. The coalition reinforcements arrived in 41 hours instead of 6 days. She filed a report noting the human assistance. It was received by the Conclave's Coordination Office, logged under miscellaneous third-party support, and largely ignored by analysts focused on the larger strategic picture. On the other side of the conflict zone, 3 species were receiving similar visits. The Peloran, who had mocked humanity in a notorious Conclave speech 4 years prior as a species of adequate intelligence and disappointing ambition, received an entire convoy of agricultural supplies when their primary food distribution network was severed by Vreth raiders. The supplies arrived before the Peloran government had even finished drafting its emergency request to the Conclave. The Peloran Minister of Survival, a position that had not existed before this war, stood at a landing bay watching human cargo loaders unload crates of nutrition packs, and felt something cold move through her despite the warmth of the bay. She messaged her government, "We made a mistake about these people. I don't know how large a mistake. I am afraid to find out." Back in the Swiss facility, Dara Kess updated the resource flow ledger and added 31 new entries to the column marked debts, unacknowledged. She was beginning to understand why the windows had been left out. Grand Marshal Ukthar was not a stupid being. This was important to understand because what he did next was not born of stupidity. It was born of something more dangerous, a need to know. After 63 days of a war that was going almost entirely according to plan, one variable sat in his mind like a splinter he couldn't reach. Humanity, the silent ones, the abstainers. He had read every intelligence file the hegemony had compiled on Earth and its people over the past century. Most of it was inconclusive. Humans maintained a mid-tier fleet, respectable, not overwhelming. Their economy was stable, their technology competitive but not revolutionary. They had no historical record of large-scale aggressive warfare in the past 150 years. Every model the hegemony's strategic division ran categorized them as a minimal threat, passive posture. But Grand Marshal Ukthar had not reached his rank by trusting models completely. He trusted instinct. And his instinct, looking at the intelligence files, kept snagging on a specific absence. Not of capability, of footprint. For a species that had been spacefaring for 2 centuries and maintained diplomatic presence across the galaxy, humanity was extraordinarily difficult to fully see. Trade routes that should have been logged weren't. Personnel manifests that should have been accessible were either missing or oddly sparse. The intelligence felt not incomplete but curated, as if someone had tidied it. He decided to test them. He diverted Battle Group 7, 60 warships under Submarshal Drekken, toward the human frontier, not toward Earth itself. That would have been a declaration of war, and Ukthar was provoking, not attacking. He aimed them at Marin's Hold, a human colony station on the edge of the contested rim, with orders to approach within weapons range and observe the response. The response, Ukthar calculated, would tell him everything. Panic meant weakness. Aggressive response meant they were hiding capability behind restraint. Diplomatic protest meant they were stalling. Any of these outcomes would give him useful data. He did not expect what actually happened. Battle Group 7 dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Marin's Hold defense perimeter at 3:40 station time. Submarshal Drekken had his fleet in full combat configuration. Shields hot, weapons charged, 60 ships in a spreading arc that made their intent unmistakable. Marin's Hold station had a listed defense complement of 12 ships and 1 orbital gun platform. What Drekken saw on his tactical display made him go very still. The 12 ships hadn't scrambled. They hadn't formed a defensive line. They hadn't hailed Battle Group 7 with demands or threats or desperate offers to negotiate. They had done nothing except rotate. All 12 vessels had oriented themselves with quiet mechanical precision, their weapon systems tracking across the incoming fleet in smooth, unhurried arcs. The orbital platform had done the same. There were no shields raised, no targeting locks broadcast, the kind of aggressive electronic signal that would have constituted a provocation. Just the physical, visible, undeniable fact of 60-plus weapon systems watching 60 Vreth ships, with the absolute calm of something that had already decided it was not afraid. Drekken hailed the station. A human officer appeared on screen. Young, unremarkable. He didn't appear to have been woken up, which meant they'd been watching Battle Group 7 since before it dropped out of hyperspace. He waited. Drekken said, "This is Vreth Battle Group 7. You are in proximity of an active conflict zone. Identify your defense status." The human officer looked at him for a moment. "Normal," he said. That was all, just the one word. No elaboration, no threat, no performance of courage. "Normals." Drekken stared at the sensor readout for 11 minutes. 63 weapon locks, 12 ships and 1 platform against 60, and not one of them had flinched. He turned his fleet around. In his report to Ukthar, he wrote 3 sentences. Marin's Hold did not respond as projected. Threat assessment models appear to be incomplete. Recommend reassessment of human classification. Ukthar read the report, read it again, sat with it for a long time. He pulled up his intelligence files on humanity again and started looking not for what was there, but for what was missing. He didn't sleep well that night. On the 91st day of the war, things began to go wrong for the Vreth. Not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that announced itself with explosions and falling battle lines. The kind of wrong that crept. The kind that made experienced commanders frown at reports that should have made sense and didn't. The kind that felt, infuriatingly, like bad luck. It started with the Gorathi Syndicate. The Gorathi were one of the Vreth's most reliable allied species, a mercantile civilization that had provided the hegemony with critical rare mineral shipments for 30 years. They were not ideologically aligned with the Vreth so much as financially entangled, which in practice was more reliable than ideology. On the 91st day, an anonymous data package appeared simultaneously in the inboxes of 12 Gorathi investigative journalists, the offices of 4 opposition political parties, and the Gorathi Tax Enforcement Bureau. The package contained 340,000 documents. They detailed, in extraordinary granularity, how the Gorathi High Merchant Council had been secretly skimming 11% of all war contract revenue into private accounts on a neutral station. Accounts registered under aliases, built over 20 years, totaling a sum that represented roughly 1/3 of the Gorathi planetary GDP. The Gorathi government imploded within 6 days. 2 council members fled. 3 were arrested. The new interim government, facing a population that was incandescent with rage at having their taxes funneled into war profiteering, immediately announced the suspension of all military supply contracts pending investigation. The Vreth lost their primary mineral supply chain overnight. Then the fuel situation began. Battle Groups 4, 9, and 12, 3 of the Vreth's most powerful forward-deployed fleet groups, began reporting anomalous fuel consumption readings. Not catastrophic, just off. Slightly higher burn rates than expected. It meant shorter operational ranges, more frequent refueling stops, logistics chains stretched in ways that required rerouting. The hegemony's supply officers couldn't find a cause. The ship systems all reported nominal function. What the supply officers didn't know, what no one in the Vreth hegemony knew, was that a routine navigational software update pushed 18 months earlier to hegemony fleet ships through a compromised third-party navigation systems vendor had introduced an extraordinarily subtle error in fuel calculation algorithms. Not enough to raise immediate alarms. Just enough over time to make fuel disappear slightly faster than the logs said it should. The update had been authored by a team of 12 people who officially worked for a navigational software firm based on a conclave-neutral world. Unofficially, all 12 reported to a woman named Dara Kess, who updated a spreadsheet in a windowless room beneath the Swiss Alps and noted the fuel anomaly figures coming in from hegemony intelligence sources with quiet satisfaction. And then there were the hyperspace exits. On 14 separate occasions over the following 3 weeks, Vreth warships dropped out of hyperspace in positions that were subtly, critically wrong. Not catastrophically off-target, nothing so obvious as to immediately suggest sabotage. Just a few degrees off the calculated exit angle, or emerging at slightly incorrect distances from their objectives, enough to disrupt tactical formations, to put ships momentarily out of supporting range of each other, to create windows of vulnerability that alert coalition commanders were just beginning, to learn to exploit. The free navigational safety, patch that human engineers had quietly distributed to conclave-affiliated relay stations 8 months before the war, had one other feature besides the legitimate improvements it advertised. In the Vreth war room, Admiral Strategist Kem stared at the loss reports and felt the specific, nauseating sensation of a pattern she couldn't fully see. Things were not going catastrophically wrong. They were going incrementally wrong, in ways that each had a reasonable individual explanation, but which, taken together, produced an effect that felt almost like intelligence. She filed a classified report to Grand Marshal Ukthar. I do not know what is happening. I know that I do not believe in this much coincidence. Ukthar received the report. He sat with it for a long time. Then he pulled up, for the 3rd time in 3 weeks, the intelligence file on humanity. He stared at it. He thought about a human frontier station that had tracked 60 warships without raising shields. He thought about a single word, normal. He reached for his communicator to call the high command. Then he stopped. Because if he was right about what he suspected, calling the high command would do nothing and might do worse than nothing. He didn't have proof. He had a feeling. And somewhere out there, he was increasingly certain, a group of people were counting on the fact that by the time anyone had proof, it would already be over. He put the communicator down. For the first time in his career, Grand Marshal Ukthar felt something he did not have a Vreth word for. The closest translation, in galactic standard, was dread. Commander Ithri was not supposed to be on this transport. She was supposed to be in command of the Silurian Third Fleet's reconstruction effort, overseeing the repair of 9 heavily damaged warships in the Cathara shipyards. She had filed leave paperwork citing personal reasons. Her second-in-command had given her a look that suggested he didn't believe the personal reasons, but also that he had learned, over 8 years of serving under Ithri, not to ask questions she hadn't answered already. She traveled alone. No staff, no diplomatic credentials. She had booked passage on a civilian liner under her own name, no attempt at concealment, because she suspected that attempting concealment from her destination would be both insulting and useless. The transport docked at orbital platform Meridian above Earth after a journey of 9 days. Ithri had spent those 9 days reviewing everything she knew, and more importantly, everything she had noticed. The supply convoy that had arrived before she'd asked. The navigational data that had been too precise to be coincidence. The way every humanitarian intervention from humanity had been perfectly timed. Not fast, exactly, but correctly timed, which was a different thing. Fast suggested reaction. Correct suggested anticipation. She had also quietly been reviewing the conflict's turning points. The Gorathi collapse, the fuel anomalies, the hyperspace exits that had cost the Vreth 3 engagement windows that should have been victories. She was not certain. She would never, she suspected, be fully certain. But she was a woman who had survived 40 years of military command by trusting the calculations she made when the evidence was incomplete, and her calculations said one thing clearly. Someone had been running this war from a room that appeared on no battle map. A human diplomatic aide met her at the docking port. Young, polite. He offered no explanation for how they'd known which transport she was on. He led her through the platform without conversation, and she appreciated that. Ambassador Yale Oren was waiting in a small room with 2 chairs and a low table. The room was warm. There was tea, 2 cups already poured. Ithri noticed that. The cups had been poured before she arrived. The temperature of the tea when she touched the cup suggested they had been poured perhaps 15 minutes ago, which meant Yale had been sitting here waiting for approximately 15 minutes. Waiting, not preparing. She had been ready before Ithri had even decided to come. Ithri sat. She looked at this woman, this quiet, silver-haired, unremarkable-looking human who had voted to abstain while the galaxy burned, and who had spent the months since sipping tea at formal functions while Ithri's people died. And she asked the question she had come 9 days to ask. How long have you been doing this? Yale Oren looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. She picked up her tea. Since before your grandmother's grandmother took her first commission, she said. Ithri had been a soldier for 40 years. She did not show the cold wave that moved through her at those words. But she felt it, felt the scale of what was being casually acknowledged, the sheer depth of patience it implied, and she understood in that moment that she had completely, fundamentally misunderstood humanity for the entirety of her career. Why, she asked, why not simply be powerful openly? Because, Yale said carefully, openly powerful things get targeted, get tested, get bled down by the ambitions of everyone around them. She set down her cup. We watched that happen to every dominant power in this galaxy for 200 years. The Vreth are only the latest example. Power displayed is power challenged. She met Ithri's eyes. Power that cannot be located cannot be threatened. You let billions of people die, Ithri said. It was not an accusation, exactly. It was a reckoning. You could have prevented this war. Yale's expression shifted, and for the first time, Ithri saw something underneath the composure. Not guilt exactly, something heavier. No, she said quietly. We could not have prevented this war. The Vreth's trajectory was fixed, if not now, within 2 decades. What we could affect was the outcome, the cost, and the shape of what came after. She paused. We have argued about this for a very long time, in rooms you will never read the transcripts of. These are not comfortable decisions. Silence held the room for a moment. What do you want? Ithri asked. In return for all of this. Yale's expression settled back into that composed, warm, unreadable thing that Ithri was beginning to recognize as its own kind of weapon. A fair galaxy, she said, and the memory of this conversation. Ithri looked at her for a long time. That's all. Yale Oren smiled, a real one this time. Commander, she said gently, you have no idea how much that is worth. Vreth hegemony did not end with a battle. This was perhaps the most disorienting thing about it, for a species whose entire cultural identity was constructed around martial supremacy. There was no Waterloo, no final, climactic engagement where banners fell and a defeated commander handed over a sword. There was instead a sequence of events that, individually, each had a perfectly adequate explanation, and which together constituted the most comprehensive strategic unraveling in galactic history. On the 141st day of the war, the Vreth's second-largest allied species, the Mactari, announced they were withdrawing from the conflict due to what they described as internal security concerns. These concerns were not fabricated. They were, however, concerns that had been surfaced through an anonymous but impeccably sourced intelligence package delivered to the Mactari's opposition legislature, from a file that the Strategic Silence Division had been sitting on for 11 years, waiting for exactly the right moment. 12 days later, the fuel anomalies in 3 Vreth battle groups became critical. Ships that should have had operational range for 4 more weeks of sustained combat found themselves grounded at resupply stations, waiting for mineral shipments that the Gorathi collapse had made unavailable. Grand Marshal Ukthar authorized emergency rationing. The rationing immediately produced exactly the kind of morale crisis that military historians could have predicted, and Ukthar's own strategists had warned about in papers he hadn't prioritized reading. On the 163rd day, Sub-Marshal Drekken, the officer who had taken 60 ships to Marin's hold and turned them around after a one-word response, submitted a private resignation communication to the High Command. He had served the hegemony for 31 years. His resignation contained no political statement. It contained 4 paragraphs about his grandchildren. The High Command, recognizing the signal value of Drekken's resignation in the current climate, quietly accepted it and hoped no one would notice. 17 officers filed similar resignations in the following week. The coalition offensive, when it came, was almost secondary. It was not a crushing, overwhelming force. It was a coalition that had been resupplied through corridors that hadn't existed on standard charts 5 months ago, guided by navigational data that had arrived without invoice, fighting an enemy whose logistics were in disarray and whose alliance network had been quietly disaggregated from the inside. The battles were real. The casualties were real. The soldiers who fought them were brave and deserving of their histories. But the outcome had been decided elsewhere. The Vreth High Command formally requested armistice negotiations on the 192nd day. The Conclave's response was swift, structured, and generous in ways that surprised many observers, a peace framework that punished the Vreth leadership without destroying the Vreth people, because destroying the Vreth people would create resentments that would require addressing in another 200 years. The peace framework had been drafted, in its essential structure, 4 years ago, by a team working in a windowless room beneath the Swiss Alps. The victory celebration was extraordinary by galactic standards. The Conclave's Grand Chamber, the same chamber where klaxons had sounded 11 times in one session, was filled with delegates in their most ceremonial dress. Speeches were made. Alliance bonds were reaffirmed with elaborate ritual gestures. Commanders were decorated. The Selorian general who had held the Third Fleet together through the worst of the fighting received a platinum citation from the Conclave Arbiter, and she wept openly, and it was genuine, and it was earned. Ambassador Yale Oren sat in seat 7G and applauded with the rest. In a windowless room beneath the Swiss Alps, Admiral Soren Vale watched the celebration broadcast on a small screen in the corner of his desk while he worked through a stack of Phase 4 briefing documents. When the Arbiter's final speech concluded, he reached into his desk drawer and removed a physical list, printed on actual paper, which was an affectation he permitted himself, and uncapped a pen. He drew a single line through an item that read Vreth Hegemony, Strategic Neutralization. The list was very long. He capped the pen, put the list away, looked at the screen for one more moment where the galaxy was celebrating its own survival without knowing quite how it had been arranged. Good, he thought, and went back to work. History, as the Conclave wrote it, was a thing of clarity. The official account of the Vreth War, published in 3 volumes and adopted as the standard galactic historical text within 2 years of the armistice, was detailed, well-sourced, and almost entirely accurate. It documented the Gorathi collapse as the result of financial corruption exposed by anonymous whistleblower sources. It attributed the Vreth fuel crises to poor logistics planning and overextension. It credited the navigational data used by coalition forces to Conclave emergency cartographic initiatives. It mentioned humanity in 4 footnotes, 3 of which related to the delivery of humanitarian aid, and 1 of which noted Earth's controversial abstention at the initial emergency session. The historian who compiled Volume 3, a meticulous Peloran scholar named Ven Saul, had noticed, during his research, a number of anomalies, data that should have existed and didn't, timing coincidences that strained credibility when examined sequentially, a pattern of human diplomatic movements in the 6 months before the war that suggested preparation rather than reaction. He had attempted to investigate. He had encountered at every turn records that were either absent or impeccably innocent. He had interviewed 16 human diplomatic and government sources, all of whom had been polite, cooperative, and entirely unhelpful. He had filed 3 formal information requests with Earth's government, all of which had been answered promptly, completely, and in ways that told him nothing. In the acknowledgments of Volume 3, Ven Saul had written a single, unusual sentence. The author notes that certain aspects of this history resist documentation in ways that the author finds professionally unsatisfying. It was the most diplomatically phrased accusation in galactic historiography. The Conclave's new charter, ratified 14 months after the armistice, restructured galactic governance in ways that most delegates celebrated as a triumph of coalition building and post-war pragmatism. The species that had fought and bled and led the coalition received the visible honors: permanent Security Council seats, enhanced defense cooperation frameworks, expanded trade privileges. Humanity received the committees. Not the exciting committees, not the ones that appeared in news coverage. Humanity was appointed to the oversight bodies for resource allocation standards, for navigational relay maintenance, for communications infrastructure governance, for historical archive management. These were the committees that no one wanted to sit on, that generated no prestige and endless technical paperwork, that dealt in the invisible architecture through which the galaxy actually functioned. The Peloran delegate had voted for this arrangement enthusiastically, grateful to have humanity doing work she didn't want to do. Director Amara Solis, watching the charter ratification from a secure feed in the Swiss facility, updated 4 separate long-range planning documents and allowed herself a single, quiet smile. Grand Marshal Ukthar spent the war's aftermath in a comfortable but unambiguous exile on a neutral world, stripped of rank and command but not prosecuted, a deliberate choice by the armistice negotiators, some of whom had consulted a document produced 4 years prior by a team working in a windowless room. He gave occasional interviews. He was generally regarded as a cautionary tale about Vreth overreach. In one interview, 14 months after the armistice, a conclave journalist asked him the question that everyone asked defeated commanders. What had been the moment he knew they had lost? Ukthar was quiet for a long time. Not the fuel, he said, not the Gorathi, not the navigational issues. He looked out the window of his exile residence at an unfamiliar sky. There was a moment early in the war. I sent 60 ships to a human frontier station, a small station, to test them. He paused. They tracked all 60 of my ships with their weapons. They raised no shields. They sent no threat. When my commander hailed them, one officer appeared on screen and said one word. He stopped. What word? The journalist asked. Normal. Ukthar was quiet for another moment. I should have turned my entire fleet around then, before any of it, before the first supply chain collapsed, before the first battle group ran short of fuel. I should have understood in that moment what I was dealing with. He turned from the window. You cannot fight something that is not afraid of you, not because it is brave, because it already knows how this ends and is simply waiting for you to catch up. The interview was published in 14 languages. It was read widely. Most readers found it melancholy, the reflection of a defeated commander rationalizing a loss. Commander Ithri read it on a quiet evening in her office aboard her rebuilt flagship. She read the last paragraph 3 times. Then she set down her data slate and looked out her viewport at the stars. She thought about a warm room, 2 chairs, tea poured 15 minutes before she arrived. She thought about the words, "You have no idea how much that is worth." She was beginning to, more clearly every day. In orbital platform meridian above Earth, Ambassador Yale Oren stood at a viewport that looked out at the galaxy. That ancient, churning, magnificent, difficult thing that had burned and been saved, and had not entirely noticed by whom. Ambassador, her aide, Peter, appeared at her elbow. The Phase 4 preliminary briefings are ready. Admiral Vale is requesting your review by end of week. I'll look at them tonight. Also, the new Keth ambassador has requested a bilateral, says it's urgent. Tell him next week. Peter nodded, started to turn, stopped. He had been with her for 6 years. He permitted himself occasionally a question. Do you ever think about telling them? He asked quietly. Any of them, what we actually did. Yale Oren looked at the stars for a long moment. Every day, she said. Peter waited. Then I remember, she continued, that the moment they know exactly what we're capable of, everything changes. Every calculation they make about us changes. Every interaction, every negotiation, every alliance, every threat assessment. She turned from the viewport. Her expression was, as always, composed, but there was something in her eyes that was not quite peace, something that looked like the weight of a very long and deliberate choice. As long as they're not sure, we are whatever they need us to be to make the right decision. The moment they're certain, she stopped. We become a target, Peter said quietly. We become a variable they have to solve for, she corrected, which amounts to the same thing. She moved past him toward the corridor. Come on, Phase 4 won't plan itself. Peter followed her, then paused at the viewport she'd left, looking out at the same stars she'd been watching. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was rebuilding. Species were counting their dead, tallying their losses, filing their treaties, writing their histories. The Vreth were reckoning with defeat. The Silurians were reckoning with survival. Dozens of species were reckoning with the strange, weightless feeling of having nearly been destroyed and somehow not having been. And quietly, in committee meetings that no one watched, and through infrastructure systems that no one thought about, and in archive records that no one would think to audit for another century, humanity continued doing what humanity had always done. Watching, recording, building. Waiting for the clock to strike. Peter turned from the viewport and went to catch up with his ambassador. The galaxy turned. The silence held. And